Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads. Today I'm going to be doing my July reading wrap up. July was a pretty good reading month in my opinion. I feel like I read some really interesting books. I tried to do a reading vlog in the month of July and just kind of fell apart halfway through. July was too busy of a month. I shouldn't have even tried to do a reading vlog in July because I just had too many things going on. And so realistically, like, there was no way for me to really do a good job of vlogging anything that I was reading. But one of the things that I was trying to do, and I did basically do, is I wanted to read all of my like arcs that I had that were basically new releases. So I actually had like 5 different books that were sent to me by publishers, either in physical form or like a digital galley. And they all were coming out in the month of July, and I was like, look, let me try to like get on top of this for once, as opposed to waiting like a year to read these books. And so I decided to prioritize reading those books over anything else. And I actually read 4 out of the 5 books. I actually started the 5th book, but I wasn't really feeling it. And since I wasn't really doing the reading vlog anyways, I decided to drop it. And not that it was a bad book, it just like was not what I was in the mood to read. But I didn't realize this until after I was done reading all of the books, that I basically only read mysteries outside of the first book. But I feel like that really works because in the summertime, people really want like mysteries, genre fiction, things that are a little bit faster paced, and that includes me now. Like, there was a point in time where my summers I would take things slower, but this year, with the way things have been going, I felt like I needed like faster paced, lighter sort of books. And so yeah, let's jump into the books that I read in the month of July. So the first book I read was called Sunshine Nails by Nguyen. This is a book that follows a Vietnamese Canadian family. The parents of the family are Vietnamese refugees who immigrated into Canada, and they opened up a nail salon, and they've just found out that rent in for their building will be going up pretty significantly. They live in Toronto. They've already been kind of like living on the edge, like barely getting by in terms of profits and things like that. And now with this significant rent increase, they don't know if they're going to be able to keep their nail salon. And so their son works at a tech company, and their daughter moved to California and has now moved back home. And the daughter, named Jessica, decides that she's going to also try to help at the nail salon to help keep it going. The other thing that's happening is that there is a significant amount of gentrification that is happening in their neighborhood, and there's actually like a brand new like nail salon slash spa that is opening up across the street. That's like this chain that started in New York, and it's very much like a modern, almost like corporate nail salon. And so they are also really worried about the opening of that salon and what that's going to mean for their business. So for me, this was an entertaining book, but it's nothing really like groundbreaking or anything along those lines. Like, if you enjoy kind of lighter family stories, then I feel like this one would be like a perfectly fine one to pick up. It's not one that I'm like, yeah, you definitely have to read this, but I feel like if you read this, you wouldn't be offended by it, basically. Like, the way this book is structured, like, you're following different perspectives. You see a little bit of every family member's like perspective. There's also like a cousin who works at the nail salon that you read a little bit about, and a couple of other people. And I feel like because there's a lot of different perspectives in this book and a lot of different characters that you're following, you don't really fully feel like you develop any of their stories. Like, this book doesn't do anything groundbreaking. Like, everything that happens to these characters, I'm like, yeah, sounds about right. But also it was like light and fun to read, and so it wasn't, again, an offensive book. But it didn't blow my mind. Like, it's very much feels to me like a middle of the road book, which is not a bad thing. Like, writing a book that people enjoy is not necessarily an easy thing to do, but it's, again, just like nothing new is really being explored here. There are some like interesting conversations around like gentrification and what these nail salons are like. There's also some like really interesting commentary here because like it does reference like the New York Times article that came out I think a couple years ago at this point, that was basically like an expose on some of the nail salons in New York City and how poorly the workers are being treated and stuff like that. So it like touches on that as well, which I thought was really interesting, and I thought brought like a very specific view to this story. Like, it doesn't ignore real life events, which I really enjoyed. Some of the things that happen in here are a little bit over the top, and a little bit just like silly when you think about it too hard, but you know, it's a slightly comedic family story, so like that's to be expected. So yeah, like I feel like this is a book that if you want something a little bit lighter, but still deals with like real topics. It has a little bit of depth to it that this is a perfectly fine one to pick up. But again, for me, it was like a 3-star book. Not bad, but not anything great either. The next book that I finished is The Mistress of Bhatia House by Sujata Massey. This is the 4th book in the Perveen mystery historical fiction series that I absolutely adore. If you've been on my channel for any length of time, then you know that I love the series so much. And I'm very lucky that Soho Press always sends me like the advanced copies of these, so I always want to read them pretty quickly. And one of the reasons why I had the idea for that vlog was because I was like, I'm not gonna want to wait to pick this book up. And I'm really glad that I didn't. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I will say that I'm like extremely biased, and this book just like is comfort food for me basically at this point. Like I always just feel so happy when I'm reading this book, and this was no exception. So if you aren't aware, this historical mystery series takes place in the 1920s in Bombay, India, or Mumbai, India, but back then it was called Bombay. And you are following this woman named Perveen, who is the first female lawyer or solicitor in Bombay, or in India, I think. Probably Bombay. In this specific book, the story begins with Perveen attending a fundraiser for like the first women's hospital in Bombay. And while she's at this fundraising event, which is taking place at the house of one of the lords in the area, somehow one of the children ends up getting like caught in flames, and the woman who like works for the family ends up putting out the child and all this stuff. But then like a day or so later, she ends up getting arrested because she's accused of having an abortion, which at this time in India is extremely illegal. And so Perveen actually ends up putting a bail for this woman and trying to figure out what exactly is happening here. She says she never had an abortion. She doesn't even like have like a boyfriend or anything along those lines in order to get pregnant. And as like Perveen looks into it, she realizes that there's some like details about around this whole situation that doesn't quite make sense. There's also a lot more personal stuff, it seems like, that's coming into play with this series, or at least in this specific book. Perveen's sister-in-law ends up having a baby, and there's some like drama around that situation. And then they've also started introducing a love interest for Perveen, and that makes some steps in this book as well, which I very much enjoy. And I typically don't enjoy like romances being introduced into my like mystery series, but this one I'm kind of into. But yeah, like I said, I really enjoyed this book. This is one of the longer ones in this series, and I think it's because of like all those other sort of side storylines that are happening in this book, which personally I'm like can take or leave. Like even though I do like the romance aspect of it, I feel like that's done lightly enough that it doesn't impede on the mystery itself, whereas like the one with the sister-in-law feels like it did a little bit, although I feel like Sujata Massey does a pretty decent job of like weaving things into the main mystery so it still feels relevant. But there are like a lot of reveals and a lot of details that come out over the course of the story that I didn't see coming. There's also a lot of really interesting discussion in here about like women's rights and women's health rights, and specifically abortion in India during this time period, that I thought was really well done, because the way that it's presented, it doesn't feel like preachy or pushy or anything along those lines. It's just also kind of stating facts about what could and could not happen, and what women were and were not allowed to do, both with their health as well as other things as well. So yeah, like those are all the things that I really enjoy about the series, but also I just really enjoy the mysteries. I really enjoy Perveen as a character, and yeah, it just feels like a fun blanket that I get to wrap myself in once a year. So yeah, big fan of the series. If you haven't checked it out already, I highly recommend it. And if you have checked out the series, I highly recommend picking up this one. All right, and the next book that I read was also another historical mystery book, and this one is called A Disappearance in Fiji. This one takes place in 1914 in Fiji. This book follows Akal Singh, who is of Indian descent but lived in Hong Kong, and he was originally a police officer in Hong Kong, and then you know that like at the beginning that something happened that caused him to get transferred to Fiji as punishment, basically. And so in Fiji, which I did not know this information prior to reading this book, but in Fiji, there were a lot of Indians who were indentured servants, and a lot of people looked down on Indians in Fiji during this time period. I don't know anything about Fiji or the culture or the history, so like I can't provide any additional context as to like current day circumstances or even historical circumstances. This is purely what is provided in this book. There is an Indian woman who ends up going missing, who was an indentured servant. The police are very like reluctant to look into it, but the main inspector ends up sending a call out to go look into the case. And it turns out that there is like a lot happening here. One is the fact that like the indentured servitude situation that's happening is not as great as people make it out to seem. Like, obviously indentured servitude in general is not going to be good, but it is like very, very poor working conditions for these people. And so it deals with, like the racism of the British colonizers who are living in Fiji, and like this like Indian man trying to investigate the situation. And there's just like a lot of stuff that's being kind of hidden from like the police and politicians and all of these different things, and also things that are just being ignored and overlooked because it's impacting like the servant class, which people generally don't care about. So even though this is a historical mystery book, I do feel like it has like a slightly different tone than the Widows of Malabar Hill. Like Widows of Malabar Hill series or the Praveen mystery series feels like lighter, but this one felt like a little bit like heavier, a little bit more serious. So if that's something that you're into, this would probably be a good series to pick up. But like I said earlier, like I don't know anything about Fiji as a country. I don't know their history. I don't know what was happening there. And so I feel like reading this book was really interesting because it talks a lot about like the class system and all of the different things that were happening around this time period in Fiji. And there's also some like really interesting commentary like about World War One and stuff like that also gets thrown in here. This is the author's debut novel, and she is Fijian, Indian, Australian. So she is of Indian descent. She, I think, was born in Fiji and grew up in Australia, or she was born in Australia and grew up in Fiji. I think it's born in Fiji, grew up in Australia though. And so one of the reasons why she wrote this book is because she found out that her great-grandparents also immigrated to Fiji from India as indentured servants. And so one of the things she talks about, I think in her author's note, is she like mentions that like she found out this information and started doing a lot of research and finding out a lot of information about this time period in Fiji and decided to set a mystery series here. So I feel like the mystery itself is fine. Like the reveals and like what actually happens, like you can kind of see it coming. At least I could kind of see it coming. So I didn't find it like too surprising. What I did really enjoy about this book though is like the time period and the historical setting and it taking place in Fiji. So it allowed me to learn a bunch of things about this topic that I probably never would have been exposed to otherwise. All right, next up, I finished With a Kiss We Die by L.R. Dorn. And this is actually a book that I ended up listening to on audio. The publisher sent me this physical copy, but they also contacted me to see if I wanted the audiobook of it. This is a full cast audiobook recording, and when we talk about the synopsis, you're going to see why you will probably want to pick up the audiobook version of this if you're interested in it. So this is another mystery book, and in this story, there are these two college lovers, or this couple, who they are accused of killing the guy's parents. And so the way this book is written is in podcast form, and you are following this journalist named Rihanna Rains. I listened to the audiobook. You would think I would remember how to say the name. These two college kids end up basically running from California to Mexico, and they will not talk to anyone. They will not return to the United States until they contact Rihanna Rains, and they're like, we love your true crime podcast. We are willing to return to the United States and talk to you about what happened. And so, of course, like she can't say no to that. And so you basically follow the podcast as it investigates this story. So the way this book is set up is literally like in transcript form. Like you can see the chapters are like the episode numbers and names. Everything is written as a transcript. There's literally no like standard novel text in here. And so I feel like reading this would be like fine. Like if you've read screenplays or like plays in general, then you'd be fine. But like really you should be listening to this as an audiobook if you're interested in this at all. The nice thing about it is that like it's a really like tight, quick read. Like I think it's less than 5 hours total. Every chapter in the book is basically an episode of the podcast, and the way that they are doing it in this story is it's all coming out relatively live. So Rihanna like goes and gets these kids and they move into the house together, and she's like interviewing them and revealing all of this information, and she's putting out episodes of the podcast with her producers as it's happening basically in real time. The way like the podcast is set up, it's like kind of as if chapters of a book are being written, because there's no like overarching person sort of like shaping the story. It's all like happening in real time, which changes at some point, but you can find out that information as you read the book. That feels a little bit like a spoiler. So yeah, like I feel like if you're the type of person who enjoys true crime podcasts, or you enjoy like books that have been coming out that are kind of playing with the true crime podcast sort of style, then you'll probably enjoy picking up this book. There were like a couple of things in here that like I found to be like a little bit weird or annoying, or just like a little bit too like hopeful. I don't know if that's the right word, but like it felt like too optimistic. Like Rhianna Raines is supposed to be this really great true crime podcast journalist, and she seems to be taking like this story that these two college kids is presenting at like face value, and does not seem to be questioning as much as I would think. She's just like putting this information out there for the general public to consume without like double checking some of this information or trying to dig a little bit more to see how much truth is actually there. There's also like a lot of praising of Rhianna Raines in this book, where it's just like, all right, like everyone loves her podcast, everyone's heard of her, which like to a certain extent I get. Like if we're talking about like Serial in, you know, our real world, then like, yeah, I would say a lot of people really know what Serial is, and a lot of people enjoyed that, but I don't know. It just felt a little bit like untrue or unrealistic. I will say like listening to this felt like very addictive. Like when you're listening to this, they do like a really good job of creating like these reveals at the end of episodes, and then they would like do these little tags like, you'll have to tune in next week to find out what happens next, sort of things, which is kind of cheesy, but like it keeps the momentum going. I feel like it's a really fast listen already, but like you feel encouraged to just like keep going to find out what the truth actually is. I will say like there isn't a 100% conclusion to the story, which may bother some people. I think you get a conclusion to the story, but I do feel like there are some threads that are left open-ended, and that again may bother some people. I don't mind it as much because it feels realistic to me. But I found like some of the reveals towards the end of the book to be kind of obvious. Like I feel like I need to talk about spoilers at this point, and so I'm going to put up like a spoiler tag on the screen, and I will put up like timestamps and all that stuff. So if you're not interested in spoilers for this book, like feel free to like skip ahead to the next book. But if you don't mind hearing some spoilers, and I'm going to talk about some pretty big spoilers, so decent warning here. So like one of the really big reveals is like these two college kids you find out are like basically like drama kids. The guy in the relationship wants to be a director, and the girl is an actress, and they like meet in college while they're putting on a performance of one of the plays that the guy has written. Once that information comes out, and there's also like points in the story where they're like being super like hammy. Like there's a scene in this book where Rhianna Raines, a journalist, is driving them to the police station, and they like are stuck in LA traffic, and the two people like jump out of the car and start dancing in the middle of the street. It's like, what? And they're supposed to be like hiding and stuff, like not being obvious that they are on their way to the police station. And like I was just like, okay, that was like the first big flag where I was like, okay, these kids are clearly lying to this journalist, and they're performing. Like this entire thing feels like a performance. And there were like also times where they're reading from journals that they wrote while they were in Mexico, and it's just like so over the top. And I was like, either this is a poorly written book, or this is all just like playing into something that they're doing. And it turns out to be the latter. And I won't get into the details of like what exactly happens, but you find out at a certain point that like they'd been lying. And I was just like, yeah, obviously, like these are drama kids. They like, my first instinct is like, yeah, they are putting on some type of performance here. I'm going to be questioning everything that they're saying. And the fact that like that doesn't happen until like way later in these episodes was very surprising to me. So yeah, that was like one of those things where I was just like, come on, Rhianna Raines. But you know, also I'm reading a true crime book, and if this was happening in real life, maybe I would not be as like skeptical, but I don't know. That just felt like a big obvious thing that like there eventually is the reveal that they've been lying. And in my head, I was just like, yeah, of course. So that was like one of those things where I was just like, is this a poorly written book, or is that just me knowing that I'm reading a book and so therefore I'm anticipating something like that? I'm not really sure. So yeah, overall, I would give this book like a 3-ish star rating. I repeat, would not read the physical copy of this book or the ebook copy of this book. I would not recommend that, because there's also like a lot of repetition if you are reading this in physical form. Like, the episodes all really start with, "Hi, my name is Rihanna Rains. This is the Rains Report, and in this episode, and we are talking about this murder case." And like, they repeat a lot of information as if it's a real podcast, like kind of doing little mini recaps, which in podcast form makes sense. In a book form, you don't need that information. And so to me, I felt like I probably would have gotten really annoyed if I was reading like a physical copy or an ebook copy or something along those lines. Like, if you wanted to check this book out, I highly, 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 highly recommend getting the audiobook version of this and just like listening and maybe following along with the book if you really want to. But again, it's like getting transcripts of a podcast. So like, I don't know how enjoyable of a reading experience that is, but your mileage may vary. But yeah, overall, like, this was, fine. It was solid. It's fun. I think this would be also just kind of like fun to listen to on a road trip or something like that, like the way other true crime stuff is. And I think there's some like kind of interesting stuff that happens towards the end of the book, but it's not a 100%. You definitely need to pick this up. But I feel like if you're like in that true crime space and you enjoy listening to true crime, then you'll have fun with this one. All right, and the final book that I have to talk about is All the Sinners Bleed by S.A. Cosby. This is a book that I picked up for a different reason. It's for my vlog that I'm recording in the month of August, and I just like could not wait to start it and to read this book specifically. And so I decided to just go for it. And so I'm going to just talk about the book here, even though you will hopefully see it in a future vlog. I shouldn't say it's definitely going to happen, because there's a lot that could happen this month, but I'm trying for a vlog. Worst case scenario, you're going to hear about the books I meant to read, or the books that I ended up reading for the vlog that never ended up going up. So anyways, this is a relatively new thriller book that came out, and I had read one other book by S.A. Cosby. I read Blacktop Wasteland. I tried to read his other book, Razor Blade Tears, and I could not finish it because it was so violent, and it really like messed with me, and I was like, I can't read this book. But I really enjoy like the way he writes and his writing style, and so I'm gonna keep reading all of his books, and we'll see how they go for me. And so this one I was able to finish. This book takes place in Charon County in Virginia, and you are following this guy named Titus, who is the first black sheriff to be elected in this town. Titus previously worked for the FBI, but he ended up moving back home because his father got sick, and you hear hints of like things happened that caused him to leave the FBI, but you don't know all the details right at the start of the book, of course. But yes, he moves back home to Virginia, and he ends up getting elected as sheriff. And a year after he is elected, there is a school shooting, and so obviously like the police get called to the scene, and so he's there, and there is a student who specifically shoots like one teacher, and he says some things about like the teacher and his circumstances that says like he needed to kill this teacher. And this teacher is someone who is like really well liked in the community and by students and all these different things. And so the student ends up killing the teacher, but then one of the police officers ends up killing the student. And so there obviously needs to be an investigation into the police officer who shoots the student. And Titus is looking into kind of the motives behind the student and what he said and all of these different things. And as he's looking into it, he ends up finding out that there is kind of this serial killer type situation that's happening in their town that no one has noticed until now. So I really enjoyed this book as much as you can enjoy a book about serial killers. I really enjoy the way S.A. Cosby writes, like I said earlier, and he just like does a really great job of taking these like really dark and complicated topics and writing them in a way that like really engrosses you. Like all of his books, in my opinion, should become movies. Like I feel like they would all do so well as movies or like miniseries. This one feels like it would be better as a miniseries, but like he writes in a way that's just like really paints a picture for like the scenes that are happening, the characters who are involved, all of these different things. And I just feel like as soon as I start reading his books, I get like immediately addicted to them. Like this was a book that I could not put down. I needed to know what was going to happen. That being said, this book is really dark. Again, it's about serial killers. It's also dealing with kids. So if you are the type of person who like has a hard time reading about books that are harmful to kids, this might be a pass for you. While I wasn't able to finish Razorblade Tears, I was able to finish this one. And that's not to say, though, that this one isn't violent. It's just like violent in a different way. Like, I feel like it's a lot of off the page violence or references to violence, whereas like Razorblade Tears, you're literally reading scenes where like the two dads are like beating people up and all this stuff. And that to me is like kind of a lot. In this one, you're reading about like violent things that are happening, but it's like they're investigating stuff that had already happened as opposed to like seeing the violent things happen. Now but there are some violent scenes later on in the book, but I felt like, again, they were tolerable for me, but your mileage may vary as always. The book is really dark though in topic. It also deals with like race relations. Obviously it's taking place in this town in Virginia where the first black sheriff has been elected. And so there's a lot of like race stuff that comes up in regards to that. There's also a lot of like small town political stuff that comes up where there's like certain people who are like, I need to be clued in on everything that the sheriff is doing. There are also police officers who are like in the pockets of other people in this town and all these different things. There's also a little bit about the mystery of Titus and what happened to him when he worked at the FBI, which when it was revealed of what actually happened, I was like, this is not that bad. Maybe I'm becoming jaded. Maybe all the mysteries and thrillers that I read, I expect like the absolute worst from everyone all the time. But like when I found out what actually happened, I was like, I mean, I get it, but also like this guy is acting like he murdered children and he didn't. So, I had like mixed feelings about that reveal and some of the other reveals about stuff from his past. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. I was really enraptured by it. I needed to know like what was going to happen. I think S.A. Cosby is just such a really, really good author. Like his stories are just so well written and I'm going to just keep reading everything that he writes as long as I can handle them. Like I feel like this is a book that's going to be on a lot of people's favorite books of the year list at the end of the year. So if you are someone who really enjoys thrillers and you are okay with darker subject matter and things along those lines, I feel like this is definitely one to put on your list. So that is everything that I read in the month of July. Let me know down in the comments below how your July reading went, or if you have any questions about anything I talked about here today, feel free to leave that down in the comment section as well. But I always love hearing about what y'all's favorite books were that you read in the past month, so definitely leave that down in the comments. So yeah, that's all I have for now, and thanks for watching.